Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the August edition of FPRI's People, Politics, and Prose. My name is Ronald Granieri. I'm the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. I'll be your host and moderator for today's discussion. All of us at FPRI are delighted to have you with us. Before we get started, I'd like to thank FPRI's allies and partners who make this program possible. And if you are visiting us for the first time today, we encourage you to consider becoming an ally is not the word I was thinking of, a member or partner of FPRI to help make programs like this work. It is through the generosity of those members and partners that we're able to offer this program free of charge for visitors, but we hope that you will consider supporting the work that we do. I wanted to mention, in addition to being the director of the Center for the Study of America and the West at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I'm also an associate professor of history at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which compels me to let you all know that the opinions that I may express in this conversation are my own and not those of the United States Army, the Department of Defense, the United States Army War College, or anybody else probably who is in any position of actual authority. But I'm looking forward to this conversation. So our topic today is democracy. And after a 20th century marked by militarism, dictatorship, and genocide, Germany has developed into one of the leading democratic states of Europe. Yet historians continue to debate the question of whether German democratic development after 1945 is primarily the result of outside pressure or internal democratic traditions, within a larger discourse about the roots of democratic development in general and the difficulties of encouraging democracy in places where it has not previously existed. Such questions have become more acute recently as economic and political crises have fed suspicion of existing political structures in Germany and in many other democratic republics. And increasingly assertive authoritarian leaders claim that democracy is itself a failed political model. One of the most creative scholars studying the history of democracy today, not only in Germany, but within a transnational framework, is Professor Hedwig Richter, whose newest book, Demokratie, Eine Deutsche Affäre, Democracy, a German Affair, argues for a more nuanced understanding of democratic development and comparative history, taking an international approach without falling into easy dichotomies of good and bad examples. Richter illuminates the continuing byplay between popular uprisings and elite reform without valorizing either. Of special note is the role of empathy in democratic development. Only when people recognize the common humanity of their fellows will they share political responsibility with them. And only when they recognize the need to respect the rights of their neighbors will they support political structures that guarantee those rights. We've all come a long way, though there is no finish line. Democracy, Professor Richter concludes, has a strange and wonderful history. It is an affair full of crises, but also full of success and new beginnings, especially for the Germans. The affair goes on. The future is open and quite possibly bright. So what are the roots of democracy? What do successful democracies have in common? How can a better understanding of democracy's past help us to understand the challenges of the future? These are some of the questions we will address today in our conversation with Dr. Hedwig Richter. Dr. Hedwig Richter is professor of modern and contemporary history at the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich. Her wide-ranging research interests include the history of democracy and dictatorship, 19th and 20th century Germany, and gender in history. After receiving her PhD from the University of Cologne, Dr. Richter held academic fellowships in Prague and Washington, D.C., among others. And her most recent book, Demokratie, Eine Deutsche Affäre, Democracy, a German Affair, was longlisted for the NDR Kultur Nonfiction Prize and shortlisted for the Bavarian Book Prize. In addition to her academic activities, Dr. Richter writes for a number of publications, including the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and Die Zeit, and we are delighted to have her with us today all the way from Munich. Welcome, Hedwig Richter.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure for me and an honor to be here with you.
So Hedwig, I want to start with a basic question is, how does this book fit with your previous work? So how did you get here to write this? One doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I want to write a complete history of democracy. So how do you get there?
Yeah, actually, my first book was on the East German dictatorship on GDR, and there I found out that elections are much more complicated. As you perhaps know, there have also been elections in socialist dictatorships, and elections just had a very different meaning, of course. And then I thought perhaps my second book should be on elections. And so I wrote the second book, my Habilitation, on elections, comparing Prussian elections with elections in the United States in 19th century. And I also had a look on other, let's call it Western countries. And I found it astonishing that how parallel the history of democracy internationally was. Of course, there are huge differences, but they are remarkably, there are a lot of parallels.
Right. I find that, for those of you who are not familiar with the German academic system, one of the real challenges, I'd say, one of the things that has to make you respect people who make it in the German academic biz is after you write a dissertation, you're then expected to write another book-length project on a completely different subject, often in a completely different field. And somehow you managed to run that gauntlet. So well done. There's so many different directions that I want to go in. I want to ask a practical question first and then a philosophical question. So the practical question that I find really interesting relates to something you just mentioned, and that is that there are lots of places that have elections, but is the holding of elections in itself proof of a democracy, or is holding in elections how do we understand, say, you've written on elections in, let's say, non-competitive elections in non-democratic states. We can talk about how sometimes elections can lead to the election of authoritarian leaders who then undermine democracy. So and yet when in the last, say, 20, 30 years, whenever there's been major political change any place in the world, everyone focuses on that chance for people to vote in an election. And so how should we understand practically the connection between the mere fact that people vote and the notion of democracy?
Of course, this is a whole different thing. Elections don't mean democracy, as you said. And but the interesting thing about elections is that within elections there is this idea that everybody should have a say, and even in dictatorships they somehow nourish this idea, though of course they don't have a say. And I think that this is one point we often don't see, that around 1900 states, modern states, I call them modern states now, they started to get their legitimacy from the people. And these were not only democracies. Most of the states introduced elections and constitutions and so forth. And in many, many states, we saw elections. And we also had elections like in the Second Empire in France. They were quite similar to the elections in state socialists, in state socialism. They were very rigged and very strongly controlled. But nevertheless, you see then at the end of the 19th century that somehow legitimacy had to be drawn from the people, and even Stalin and then even Hitler couldn't turn this back. So even they somehow held elections and pretended to somehow get their legitimacy from the people, whatever the people is.
Right. This is what I find fascinating. Right. Even those, and of course, this gets into another issue of who are the people, right? Certainly, the populist argument that there are the real people, and then there are somehow other folks who happen to live within the boundaries of the territory who, for one reason or another, are not the people. So when I say I speak for the people, I'm not necessarily claiming that a majority of the individual human beings who live in this region would vote for me. I'm just saying that somehow I reflect the people. And that's what I think about, is that sometimes an emphasis on the will of the people, the general will, is not, while that can be a democratic impulse, it doesn't have to be. And sometimes it can work against democracy.
Yes, exactly. What I also found astonishing is that within democracies and within, for example, like in the United States, but then also in the democracies in the interwar periods, you can see that within democracies there is a tendency to populism and even a tendency to fascism. And so the history of democracy is not this bright history of becoming better and better and more people get involved, but it is also, it's a very, very ambiguous history, and it's a very difficult history. And we should never forget that fascism after the interwar period, and of course National Socialism, they didn't come from monarchies, from authoritarian states, but they came from democracies. And Hitler always stressed that he is the real democracy, and that they no longer need, Nazis no longer need a parliament and all these terrible parties, but they are the real democracy, and they really do what the people want.
Right.
And
well,
so, of course, this is one stride of democracy, one aspect of democracy. And I think how should democracy work to prohibit to work not without becoming a populist or fascist?
Right. I mean, that there is there's the famous line that's often associated with a former member of the U.S. Supreme Court, Robert Jackson, who said the U.S. Constitution should not be a suicide pact, right? So that the allowing of freedom should not mean the allowance of those who would then destroy the freedom. But how do you do that, right? Clearly, the Germans after 1949 talked a lot about wehrhafte Demokratie, right? So a democracy that can defend itself. But how do you do that? Well, if democracy is about freedom, and of course, these are all loaded phrases, right? I would say in American political discourse, right, you can get into a lot of arguments where somebody will sit back in their chair and they'll say, well, actually, right, the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic, which is one of those things that's, you know, sort of true and irrelevant, right? Because it is a republic that elects its representatives through democratic means. So it's the same sort of thing. But
a very important point. Very, very important.
Yes. I always feel like I have to bring that up. I'm sure it might be on the minds of people who are listening. But this idea.
I just want to add that very often it's said that in the beginning of the American democracy, it was a republic, and they regarded it as a republic, and then it became more and more democracy. But it was much more difficult, and so one scholar called it a republic, another called it democracy, and so this is just one of the myths, historical myths, that there is this huge difference between republic and democracy in history. We don't have it.
See, and this is good, because this gets to the philosophical question I wanted to get at, especially when we're talking about Germany, is the idea about when we talk about the development of democratic states. And development of democracies, right? For much of the 20th century, of course, Germany is the terrible example where democracy leads to, or eventually the emergence of National Socialism, genocide, all that. And so the idea was, where did the Germans go wrong? Was there something specifically wrong about Germany's democratic development? And your work, not to spoiler alert, right? Your work challenges the idea that Germany is somehow a bad example, or that there are like there's positive examples of democratic development here and Germany over here. Can we talk a little bit for our audience about the sort of the discourse you are arguing with when you try to make this distinction, or try to break down this distinction, and what it means for our understanding of the history of democracy in Germany?
Yeah. First, let me say, of course, Germany is the bad example regarding National Socialism. I think this is very, very important, because now sometimes in post-colonial contexts, it is somehow, I think, relativized. I think it's very, very important to have the colonial history much more in focus. But I think for me, as a German scholar, it is always very, very important to have Holocaust within the horizon I work. And I always also have the question, why Germany and why 1933? I think that's really very important. But I think the easy question, why Germany, why 1933, is there was this Sonderweg, and Germany, some started Sonderweg with Martin Luther, and some with Hegel, and some with the Kaiserreich. And I think this would be much too easy. And from all what I saw from the 19th century, it's not convincing, because what we see in the German development is that many German states had a parliament right from the beginning of the 19th century, and the electorate was quite broad, in some states even broader than in the United States, and there were furious elections, and battles over who will win the seats in parliament. And then we have constitutions. And when you look at I call it the North Atlantic era, when you look at these countries, very often within 10 years happens about the same. So for example, in the beginning of the 19th century, very often democracy is enforced from above, from elites, from reformers. And what we see at the end of the 19th century is that around 1870, in many, many states, universal male suffrage is introduced. In Germany, a little bit before the United States with the amendments. And in England, we have the Second Reform Act, which broadens the electorate, and so forth and so forth. And so the parallels are really striking. And Germany was not this dark didn't have this dark exceptional development, but dark aspects are within this history of democracy. So when we see in the end of the 19th century the mass politicization and a strong democratization in many, many countries, we also see at the same time a very strong exclusion. So inclusion, the democratic inclusion very often enforces exclusion. For example, in Germany, anti-Semitism became very strong, or in the United States, you had a peak of lynching around 1900. So right. the equal people, the equal white men felt much more equal, much more democratic by excluding others and by othering those who didn't belong in their eyes to the people.
Right. And go ahead, please.
Yeah, no. So, and I think we can also see like colonialism. It's not just there are the good democracies, and then there was this. We can't really explain why these modern states had like France or Great Britain or why they had a colonialism. But I think it's really part of this development, and it really makes sense to see this darker part of democracy and to connect it with aspects like colonialism.
Right. I mean, because this idea that it only makes sense to create a club if it's one thing, a club is made for its members, but it's really also made, you have to be able to say who doesn't belong, because otherwise there's no value in being a member of the club, right? This is so that's a larger social problem. And this the relationship between the development of democratic structures and the rise of ethnic nationalism, right, is because ethnic identity is one way to identify who belongs and who doesn't. And in that sense, right, Germany is not unusual in this period in the 19th century and into the 20th century. But the arguments that you've just made are in some ways controversial, right? You get some pushback from other scholars who feel that to talk about Germany being democratic in the 19th century and in the early 20th century is somehow relativizes the term or the meaning of democracy. And I'm thinking, back, gosh, almost 20 years ago now, right? Margaret Anderson wrote a book, Practicing Democracy, right? Which I'm sure you're familiar with, right? And that's the first time I encountered this, somebody actually laying out that, well, the Germans were voting for lots of things, and they had democracies and they had constitution. Does the fact that we can say, right, you can have that democracy, there can be a democratic tradition with all of its light and shadow, and sometimes it will lead, sometimes things will get better, sometimes things will get worse. What does this do to our understanding of, let's say, of the process of democracy, right? Because Aristotle would suggest, right, the more you do something, the better you get at it, right? And if you keep doing it, eventually it becomes you. But it is very possible, and we have all these examples of states that have democracy, that have votes, and then still will abandon democracy. And what does this tell us about, I don't know, about our understanding of this ongoing affair of democracy? I first want to make a point I should have made earlier, that in the historiography, I think since the 1980s, historians say there is no Sonderweg, because True. What should a Sonderweg be? This is very important, and great scholars like Margaret Anderson or Christoph Nonn showed very clearly that the Kaiserreich was not this dark Sonderweg that had to lead to 1933. True. But in the public discourse, it is still very, very strong. And then are some
some guys who still somehow believe in the Sonderweg, and they were very upset about my book, because my book brought this idea that Germans didn't have a Sonderweg into public, and it tried to show this broad research on that Germany is not a Sonderweg to the public, and this was one reason why it was so upsetting for many. Though since decades we really know, we have the research that Germany does not have a Sonderweg.
Right. I mean,
so
it is funny, as I remember getting ready for my oral examinations in graduate school in the early 1990s, and even then we both had to learn what this Sonderweg or special path argument was, so that we could also then argue that it made no sense or that it was wrong, because we all read our Blackburn and Ely, right? And so exactly, it is a funny thing is we keep bringing that along with us, right? We have to, because it is. It's a little bit like the Versailles the argument that the Treaty of Versailles was terrible, right? Scholars know they've relativized that, but people still feel that way. Well, and that,
I want to tell a story that Margaret Anderson told me. Margaret Anderson, her book is really great. I have to show
outstanding.
It to you.
Yes, that's a great picture on the front. Yes, it's a great book. Yeah, right.
And she said whenever she teaches German history, and especially the German Empire, and she always tells the students there is no German Sonderweg, and she shows all these arguments, and then in the end, in the exams, people again and again they repeat the Sonderweg. She said it's just in the heads. It's just so difficult to get it out of there.
No, it's so true. I have to say, as somebody who's taught diplomatic history for a long time, right? The Treaty of Versailles. No matter how many times I try to relativize or contextualize the Treaty of Versailles, it's like my words are spoken in the wind, right? This is the thing that some things are just. But this gets into an interesting question too. Is that you, in addition to your prodigious scholarly work, you also remarkably find the time to write articles in newspapers and magazines, and to try to reach the broader public. And how do you see the role of the academic historian in speaking to a broader non-academic, sort of the interested public? And how do you approach things differently in how you write, how you argue, or how do you manage those two worlds?
Yeah. Oh, good question. I must say I always liked writing, and it takes a long time for me to find the right words, and I think it's very important to write so that it is good to understand, to write clearly, and so there are these. It's quite similar to in this regard. It's quite similar to write in newspapers and to write a scholarly book. But of course, when you write a book or an article in a journal, then it can be much more complicated, and you can count on that the readers know much more than when you write for a public newspaper.
Right.
So of course there's a difference, and the role of the public of a historian. I would be very interesting what you say, Ronald. I think it's quite important. Like for example, I think we've very quickly talk about the crisis of democracy, and we always talk about the crisis of democracy. We talked about the crisis of democracy right after 45, of course, and then in the 50s, 60s, whenever. And I think sometimes it's hard for democracies to stand these discourses of crisis, and it would be easier and better for democracies if we wouldn't all the time find this diagnosis that there is a crisis. Right. And when you look at the history of democracy, you see that many aspects are not aspects of a crisis, like that the voter turnout is not very high. So it is in the history of democracy, you should ask, why do voters go to the polls? And this is a very interesting question.
So now it's not why they stay away, but it's why they bother to do it at all. Oh.
Exactly. Of course, it is very important that they go, and the more the better. But as soon as you look on the history of democracy, everything becomes much more complicated, and you really have to hesitate to talk about a crisis of democracy.
Right.
So
I
what
think
do
about
you
this.
think about it?
Well, I mean, I part of me is like going back to the beginning of this conversation, right? Is the temptation of the scholar when the scholar appears in public is to be that the well actually guy, and we don't need to be that guy, right? We
Yes.
and frankly, it's always a guy, so you don't want to be that guy at all, right? I try not to be that guy, but it is the temptation is great, right? Is to always sort of wade in and say, well, it's more complicated than you think, or well, you don't understand this, but. I think the most important thing that historians can do, and this is why I'm so impressed with how you do it, one of the most important things historians can do is to help people to understand that it is important in itself to understand the roots of things, right? That not that understanding the past is going to give you an infallible vision of the future, but that we have to realize that these problems aren't new, right? I mean, this is what I think is interesting about about your book and about all your other work is that you point out that democracies. They ebb and they flow, both within themselves as well. And even successful democracies, right? People forget that the United States of America, between say about 1804 and almost the 1840s, was a one-party state, right? There was debates within the one party, which was the Democratic Republicans, but you can have some sort of competitive elections, and you can have all this stuff. But there are times when there's more disagreement than others. And also, and this is something I think about in your work and in the work of Amy Gutman, that democracy is about disagreement. So the fact that people disagree, even that there's partisanship, is not necessarily a failing of a democratic political order, right? That's what it's supposed to be. As long as those debates are taking place within a framework where we're all sort of assuming that each other is arguing in good faith. And that's when it gets difficult is when I say, you know what, I don't think your positions have any place in this society, so therefore we're just going to ignore you. And so that's what I think about the democracy. One of the reasons why I quoted the last sentence of your book is because I like the idea that we have to understand that democracy is a process. It's not a destination.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and the turnout issue. This is a fascinating question, right? Is it good that more people vote? Sure, of course it is. But there are lots of reasons why people don't vote. If I make a trivial comparison, but I think about it a lot, is that everybody remembers and reflects when the airline loses their luggage, right? When your bag gets lost, right? It is a catastrophe. You're angry, but rarely do we reflect on how many pieces of luggage successfully reach their destination. And so we tend to focus on what went wrong. Theodore Robb writes this in his the crisis of the 17th century, that historians and everybody, right, like psychologists, right, we tend to focus on the abnormal. We tend to focus on crises, and we don't reflect upon stability and what stability means. And to try to figure out how that works. And so that's what I think about this entire discussion about democracies. We recognize when it's breaking down, but we don't reflect enough on how it works when it's working.
Very good point. Yeah. I think it's in my research, it's very important to and this closely connects to what you say, to look on reforms. That very often democratization happens through reforms. But very often we find this idea that the history of democracy is the history of revolutions, and this is really amazing. It's absolutely amazing, like huge democratic processes, like the one I quoted in 1870, around 1870, and these very reforms. And very often you can't see these years in the histories of democracies because there was no revolution.
Right.
And so as long as it's going on quietly and very often, as long as elites play a role, for example, to reform the election reforms in Germany or in Great Britain, were to a great deal top down, then we tend to overlook it. And I think there are many interesting reasons why we are so strongly focused on revolutions. And one reason is gender. It's much more attractive to have male revolutionaries setting the world on fire and fighting on barricades than to have those boring reforms. And women in general were much more engaged in reforms than in revolutions.
Right.
for whatever reasons, but
well,
I think that's
this I think is one of the things that people should understand about your work is how you bring in the issues of gender and issues of the body. That so much of democracy is built around or develops as people realize that each fellow, and I don't want to use the word citizen because we're not necessarily that's a loaded term, but each other individual should be entitled to a certain degree of bodily autonomy and protection, right? You start the book by talking about how torture becomes something that people realize is just not appropriate anymore, right? And that because and so you, by having empathy and understanding for the freedom and the security of other people's bodies, that also leads us to understand rights. It leads us to understand that people have a role to play in developing society, and that for women, right, this is this is essential, because it is as women become respected as autonomous bodies, right, literally and figuratively, then they're given the chance to vote and to participate in political life.
This is it's also there. You also can see the great developments we often overlook, like I think it was just impossible to give the right to vote to people in the countryside. And when I started studying this, I wandered by in France for a long time, in France and in Germany, in other Europe states, but also in the United States. People on the countryside did not have the right to vote, and in Europe, at least, it had a lot to do with they didn't have enough to eat. They just lived in absolutely poverty, in bodily terrible circumstances. And it goes hand in hand to regard somebody as a political subject, and that the body is treated like this. And so one very important step in the history of democracy is to scandalize poverty, to not to take it, and hunger, to not to take it as something God-given. Most of the people live in poverty, we can't really change it. Or there were all these discourses, and this really changes in the 19th century, that poverty became a scandal. And that many reform movements, that the most important, of course, was the worker movement, which is very, very important, and it was bottom up. But we also had reform movements from many female reform movements, from elitist women, but also from working women and so forth.
Yeah, this is my students are tired of hearing me quote Brecht, who said that erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral, right? So first you go, but if eating comes first and then you worry about morality. But the idea that there is a connection between the two, right, is that people have to have a degree of stability and a degree of respect for the need to protect their livelihood, then they can be treated as citizens. And this is, I want to bring in some of the questions that are coming in on the Q&A feature. And I'm delighted that our viewers and listeners are used the Q&A feature without me having to remind them to do it. So I guess we have a very well-trained bunch of listeners here. But Charles Burhan writes, says, do we sometimes commingle economic comfort and prosperity with democracy? And does materialism soften the edges of political conflict? And I guess the idea does democracy work better if, as you say, right, you get to democracy when you're willing to believe that people deserve a basic standard of living, maybe. But is it then prosperity makes democracy work? And therefore is it economic crises are what challenge democracy?
Yeah, that's of course a crucial question. I would say that democratization was not possible without the resources of the industrialization, because for democratization you need education for everybody, and you not only need that people can live in dignity, but you also need that people have, for example, enough money to buy a newspaper. And that the state is strong enough that everybody has the same language, which is a very interesting process. In France, it was only in the last third of the 19th century that the state really forced people to learn France and not to speak those different dialects. And this was very important for the Republic in the last third of the 19th century. And, Yeah, so there are many aspects that really need resources, really need wealth as basis of a democracy, and also that people are not hungry, of course. And I think the introduction of the welfare state is a very important part for liberal democracies, so that everybody has the chance to participate, to have enough to live, to participate in politics.
Right. I mean, I guess it's funny, right? In English, we use the phrase when you live in straitened circumstances, right? So very tight, and Germans will use that word eng as well. That
Right.
if your immediate physical needs are not met, then your focus is going to be hyper local. Right, that you do need a sense of you need to be able to look further, but you can only do that if you have that degree of stability. Well, and this raises a philosophical question. Michael Schwartz asks, is that the relation between democracy and excellence, right? And so in a democratic society, right, how do you there are periods where democracy may encourage a meritocracy, right? Because it gives people the freedom to rise. But there's also the danger that democracy, and Tocqueville talks about this too, right? Democracy can also encourage a kind of mediocrity, right? That the democracy means, that people don't want to necessarily stand out. And how do we understand the relationship between sort of meritocracy and democracy?
Yeah, I always say it's absolutely okay if the members of parliament are just normal people. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
And I think the system is in every democracy, we somehow have checks and balances, and all the parliaments they speak with experts and so forth. And I think that perfectly works. But what I also think is that that democracies not only need the people, whatever the people is, but let's say the majorities, but they also need the elites. And one thing we saw in the Weimar Republic was that elites didn't support democracy, and I think this is one aspect of the question of meritocracy and democracy, that we really need the intellectual elites and economic elites and so forth.
Yeah, and I guess that's the idea about, so Jeffrey Allen asks about democratic backsliding and the role of institutions in protecting democracy. And this gets to an interesting question about elites as well, right? In many contemporary states, right, one of the institutions that's supposed to protect against democratic backsliding is the courts. So we rely on the courts to protect rights or whatever. And yet these are, by their nature, right, non-democratic elite institutions. And so I'm curious what you feel about the role of those institutions. And this is also because you do mention in your writing how much the creation of democracy is sometimes driven by elites, that it's not always driven by folks from below. And yet, how can institutions that are themselves, let's say, not democratic, but they serve the protection of a democratic society, how can we look to them for protection for democracy without them then undermining that democracy?
Yeah, I think that the history of democracy is always also the history to curb democracy.
Okay.
And also to curb the people's will. And checks and balances is one of these developments. And in many democracies, you have two chambers. You not only have the parliament, but you also have the upper, this Oberhaus or the Senate or whatever. And you have many of these institutions. And I think the Supreme Court, of course, is one of these institutions. And it is very important for democracies to have these different aspects. And I think what Europe learned after 1945, and especially Germany learned it, but also other European countries. Martin Conway wrote a great book on democracies in Europe after 1945, is to curb the people. This was really one thing they learned from fascism and from National Socialism, that to have a strong democracy, you have to protect it also against, sometimes against people. And so if there is a majority who wants to destroy democracy, and in Germany it's called a militant democracy, as you called it, then there is the constitution, and the constitution says no, it doesn't work like that. And then the Supreme Court also helps to support democracy, sometimes against the parliament and sometimes against the will of the people.
See, this
against majorities.
Against the majorities. I mean, this I think is fascinating, right? Because often, right, within in an American political discourse, right, the republic not a democracy argument is always, well, because they're equating democracy with majority rule at all times.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's not democracy. You're saying that democracy includes preserving the rules of the system.
Exactly. Yeah. The democracy, one very important aspect is the rule of law in democracies, which, by the way, Germany was very good in the 19th century.
Right.
And as soon as you don't have the rule of law, democracy is really challenged, and it's a question if there is still democracy.
I remember years ago in a class on the early American Republic, we read Henry Adams wrote a history of the United States under Jefferson and Madison. And he has a quote in the very beginning, one of the villains in his story is Alexander Hamilton, because Hamilton is accused of being, right, the defender of the elite. And apparently at a dinner in New York, after a speaker talked about extolled the glories of the people, right, this is apocryphal story, is Hamilton stood up and said, "Your people, sir, is a great beast." Right, the argument that it needed to be controlled, and yet, and that's often presented as an example that Hamilton is against democracy. And of course, these days, right, Hamilton is a lot more popular than he was when Henry Adams was writing. So, but the belief that something that part of creating a democratic order is creating structures that are legitimate and can put restraints, right, on people, and that doesn't mean that that's not democracy.
Exactly, and it doesn't mean that that very often, of course, democratization is enforced by the people and enforced by revolutions and so forth. But this is only one aspect of the history, and I think to understand democracy or the history of democracy is to see all these ambivalences. It's really much more complicated than to say it's only the elites, it's only the people, it's only class struggle, which is very, I think it's an absurd idea to think that people always have one motive in mind and one mindset with one motive, and that history is driven by this very simple struggle. Right. And I think to understand democracies today and all its difficulties and ambivalences, it's very good to look in history and to see how difficult it was to develop and how widersprüchlich, how
contradictory,
exactly. Yeah. Very often the democracy is so contradictory, but it makes sense as soon as you look into history.
Right. Well, and that's why I think it was inspired, right, that you refer to it as an affair. Right, the word with multiple meanings, right? Because it's an ongoing relationship, right? One could also, it's a dance, right? The dance between elites and the people.
Yeah. And there's always crisis. I also think that this is important. I'm very much against the crisis discourses, which are often too strong. But somehow democracy is you can say it's always in crisis. But crisis is not this apocalypse, but we should take this as a challenge and to grow with and to strengthen our democracies within these normal crisis.
Normal crisis, yeah. And I would say it's between talking about democracy is always in crisis. The transatlantic relationship is also always in crisis.
Oh, yes.
By the way, I can tell you, right? So I
exactly.
You'd wonder what would we do with stability. I see an interesting question from William Rayford asked a question, which is sort of outside of both of our comfort zones, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And that was when we talk about the body and about stability. How does China's bringing 770 million people out of poverty in the last 40 years equate with democracy? So we have a sense of, bodily improvement, right, to a certain extent, right? The material conditions of life are improved and is completely disconnected from any democratic political forms. So this of course is a counter argument to the optimistic belief that prosperity and democracy will eventually pull each other up. Do you have any thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I think it's actually not a mechanism, and the growth of wealth is not the only reason for the development of democracy. There were also this strength of ideas of freedom and ideas of equality, which had a long tradition within the European thinking. I actually think that democracy started, or this liberal democracy started in 19th century in the North Atlantic era, which does not mean it could also be taken up in other parts of the world, of course. But so I think democracy is not something that self-evidently develops. This is also what I want to show. It is very, very difficult that it develops, and it needs wealth, but it also needs these ideas and state rule of law and so forth. And so I think there's no mechanism that the growing wealth will lead to democracy. It helps democracy. It is very important for democratization, but it does not necessarily.
It's not necessary. Yeah, that's I think is interesting because of course prosperity can stabilize whatever regime happens to be in place, right? Because that regime can say I'm responsible for this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
John Curtis asks a generational question about Germany that I think is worth reflecting on, and that is when we think about German democratic development after 1945. Is how much of that was the result of a younger generation moving in and moving out, a generation that had different ideas, and how do we? So when you think about how Germany has developed, what role is do demographics essentially shape democracy, or do you feel when do you feel that, say, in your understanding of German post-war history, right? When was Germany a stable democracy after 1945, right? Was it, because certainly throughout the 50s and 60s, a period that I originally studied, right? Everybody's always afraid that tomorrow the Germans are going to wake up and go back to the way they were. And the fact that the Germans keep not doing that is a source of constant sort of wonder, but nobody's ever satisfied. Do you think, what role do generational changes play in democracy, in the development of democracy?
Yeah, of course they play a great role, and I think the new generation in 1968 was of course very, very important for many democratization effects. But then again, it makes sense to have an international look, and I like this book by Martin Conway, especially because he sees that there are many parallels in different countries, and I think what is important that Germany, that it worked after 1945 was that they had this very long democratic history, and Nazis did not manage to destroy it. Of course, they, in many regards, they destroyed democracy, they destroyed parliamentarism and civil society and so forth, but they couldn't destroy this way over 100 years history of democracy. And like after the First World War, it was after the Second World War for Germans, it was the normal thing they had to do was to go to the polls and to elect parliaments. It was not a big discussion, or should we do it or shouldn't we do it. This was just the thing everybody did, and it was a very calm thing, and they knew it right before. They had it for decades and sometimes for 100 years. And so I think this is a very important point why it worked. And what is interesting about the Grundgesetz, the West German constitution, is that this was not a younger generation, because the younger generation were the Nazis. And Nazis were
right.
Extremely young movement, an extremely revolutionary movement, Hitler had the youngest government ever in Germany.
Right.
If you look at great Nazis, very often it's amazing how young they are. And so in the Grundgesetz, you see a lot of from the old times who grew up during the Kaiserreich, and I would say during this great time of reforms, this very ambiguous time, of course, but it was also a time of democratization, and they were very important for the Grundgesetz.
This is where I am compelled, of course, to mention Konrad Adenauer was in his 70s in 1949 when he becomes chancellor, right? But that the idea is it's an older generation in combination with, let's say, the generation of the lieutenants, right? So younger. So this is why there are some politicians who start their political careers at the beginning of the Federal Republic and are still active at the time of reunification, right? Because that's how young they all were, right? The Willy Brandts of the world, for example.
Exactly. That's very important.
So Fritz Heinzen asked a question about historians, and you've mentioned Martin Conway. I believe that's Europe's Democratic Age, I think is the book. Is that the book you're referring to, right?
Yeah.
And then see, I'm not sitting next to my shelves, but I like the fact that you are, that you already pulled off Margaret Anderson.
Yes.
You know, a historical anecdote, right? Is you mentioned in writing, right? The chair of the committee that wrote the Grundgesetz was Carlo Schmid, right? As you know, this social democratic. He was a professor who was famous for, when he'd have young parliamentarians over to his apartment, right, that he would, always in the middle of a discussion, he would say, "It reminds me of a text," and he'd be able to walk over to his shelves and pull off a book and open it up. And everybody always wondered, how far in advance he planned those things, or whether he just knew what was on his shelf. But you did an excellent job there in the spirit of Carlo Schmid. But Fritz asked the question about which German historians or historical figures inspire you, and which English language historians you feel best understand German history these days.
Yeah, I really admire Margaret Anderson, because she, when she wrote this book, still most of historians believe that elections in Germany were just some in the empire, the German Empire, were just some kind of fake elections,
right.
and she showed it so clearly, and she also always make this international comparison, and there she showed that Germany was in many aspects even quite progressive with these elections, and also with parliamentarism. And and it's just a great work, the sources she uses and how she writes, and it's really an amazing book. It's a pleasure to read this book. And many historians on women history are very important for me, like Angelika Schasser. And I think if you think more about women's history, we also, I already talked about it, we also become a very different a new look on the history of democracy. Right. And if we don't only tell the stories of revolution, then we start to see that there are women like working class women, but also upper class women who fought poverty, and who work for democratization and reforms.
Sure. You mentioned Olympe de Gouges, for example, as early on in the French Revolution.
Yeah, and very important is also Lynn Hunt. And with Lynn Hunt, I came to this idea of emotions, how important are emotions. And then Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who also thinks a lot about democratic emotions, and and there the body of course plays a very important role.
Right. Well, and you're part of a generation of German historians who are very international and transatlantic, right? And so you had a fellowship at the German Historical Institute in Washington, is that right? Which of course is a great look, 2 times. There you go, rock on. It's a great location for this. It is very interesting, as somebody who comes at it from the American side, but that the Germans who speak English, read the English language literature, and are writing in German. I am. Where did you get this impulse from? So, you studied in Cologne. I think when you were there, Jürgen Heideking he'd already passed away. I think. I don't think he was, but he was a pioneer in these sorts of things. And you studied in Heidelberg. I don't know if you were with Professor Juncker, who was very important in these things. Yeah. But at what point in your training did you realize you were going to be sort of international / transatlantic in your approach?
I think it's when I started working on democracy and these elections, I thought as long as we only work nationally, then everything is a Sonderweg. As long as we don't start to compare things, and it is very funny that many phenomena in German democratic history are interpreted as typical German, but it is just transatlantic. You just find it everywhere where there were elections in the 19th century, for example. So I think this was very important. And then for me, it was. I still think it's very obvious that these huge developments are transatlantic developments. And I think I should have much more to broaden my view to look more on colonialism how did democracy start in other parts of the world? But still, I think this is the roots of democracy are in Europe and in North America.
And of course, right, one has to start somewhere, and I'm sure
of course,
there's always more books and articles to write, and you can and when you write those new books and articles on new subjects about democracy in the post-colonial world, we will be sure to bring you back here. We're just about out of time, but I want to ask you one last semi-unfair question, and that is, your book ends on a hopeful note, an optimistic note. Are you optimistic about the future of democracy?
Yeah, I am actually optimistic, though in the last few months, I realized that the destruction of the climate is really a huge crisis. Mm-hmm. And I think that the big questions for democracies today and for tomorrow are, how can we deal with this crisis? Are democracies fit to deal with it? And I'm optimistic because I think democracies really, they're fit and they're the right system to deal with this crisis. Though right up to now, it doesn't really look like that because right. They're not fast enough. But I think what we see in the couple of last months is that people actually realize, and also politics realizes, that action is needed and that they have to do something.
Right. Well, and I guess that's the idea is that a phrase that was used when George Kennan talked about American democracy and foreign policy. He said that the problem with democratic states, he of course is very much an elitist. He believed that it was like democracies are like gigantic dinosaurs sitting in a swamp, and it takes a lot to get them to move. But once they move, right, they have a lot of weight to throw around, right? He was very negative on this view, but there's a potentially optimistic way to think about that, right? Because once a democracy does move with the weight of its legitimacy behind it, perhaps it can actually solve these problems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah.
So we can hope with that.
Yes, absolutely.
Hedwig Richter, it has been a delight to have you on People, Politics, and Prose. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights on your work. We encourage people to track you down on Twitter. You tweet in both German and in English. There's no telling what, including long quotes from the great Southwest German poet Hölderlin, which if you want to broaden your horizons, I recommend it. But thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you so much. And thank you for the interest. Yes, it was a pleasure.
It's been delightful. FPR would also like to thank, as I say, our sponsors and our partners for their generous support, and all of you for joining us. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time so that we can continue these conversations. Even if this conversation is over, the world goes on and we will be here to discuss it at FPRI. If you would like to keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events in FPRI, visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. So we will hope to see you again. And until next time, for all of us here at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.